There's nothing quite like watching everything you've worked for turn to ash in a single night. For Silas Boone, that's exactly what happened when wildfire swept through his Montana ranch, taking his home, his livelihood, and leaving him with nothing but his loyal dog Tucker and a lifetime of memories that now felt more like ghosts. With winter coming and no place to go, Silas found an old abandoned cabin deep in the mountains. The roof leaked, the walls were rotting, and most folks would have walked away. But Silas saw something different. Over the next few months, he and Tucker began rebuilding, not just the cabin, but something much more meaningful. Word spread about the old mountain man and his simple way of life. Soon, people started showing up at his door. But what was it about this remote cabin that drew so many lost souls from across the territory? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the valley floor like an old man's breath on a cold day, and Silas Boone stood at the edge of what used to be his world. The acrid smell of charred timber still hung in the air 3 weeks after the fire, mixing with the pine scent that had always been home to him. Tucker sat beside him, the border collie's black and white coat dulled with ash that no amount of creek water seemed able to wash clean. Silas reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the only thing he'd managed to save from the flames, a photograph of him and Sarah on their wedding day 28 years ago. The edges were singed brown, and smoke had clouded the glass, but her smile still shone through. Sarah had been gone for 5 years now, taken by the cancer that crept through her like a slow fire. But this ranch had been their dream together. Every fence post, every building, every carefully tended acre had been a testament to what two people could build when they had love and determination. Now, it was all gone. "Come on, boy," Silas said, his voice rough from too many sleepless nights and too much smoke. "Ain't nothing left here for us." Tucker's ears perked up at the familiar command. But the dog's brown eyes held a confusion that mirrored his master's. This had been Tucker's world too, chasing rabbits through the pastures, herding the cattle that were now scattered to neighboring ranches or claimed by insurance adjusters. The dog had lost his purpose, along with everything else. Silas had been born 63 years ago in these very mountains, delivered by his grandmother in a cabin not 10 miles from where his ranch had stood. His father, Thomas Boone, had been a logger who understood that the land gave only what you earned through honest work. His mother, Ruth, had taught school in the one-room schoolhouse down in Clearwater until she married Thomas and moved up to the mountain to raise 5 children on determination and venison stew. Silas had been the youngest, and maybe that's why he'd inherited the stubbornness that kept him on this mountain when his brothers and sisters had all moved to cities with names like Portland and Seattle. He'd found Sarah at a church social when he was 35 and she was 29, both of them old enough to know their own minds and young enough to believe they could build something lasting. They'd bought the ranch with money Silas had saved from 15 years of logging and Sarah's inheritance from her father's grain elevator business down in Billings. It wasn't much, 600 acres of mountain meadow and pine forest, with a creek that ran year-round and soil that would grow hay if you knew how to work it. But it had been theirs. The fire had started in the national forest, sparked by a lightning strike during the driest August in 40 years. Silas had watched it creep closer for 3 days, helping neighbors evacuate their stock and hoping the wind wouldn't shift. But wind, like most everything else in the mountains, had a mind of its own. On the 4th day, it turned and came roaring up the valley like a freight train made of flame and fury. Silas had managed to get the horses out and turn the cattle loose to fend for themselves. He'd loaded his pickup with Sarah's china and their important papers, the photograph, and a few other things that held memories more valuable than gold. But the fire moved faster than he'd expected, and in the end, he'd barely escaped with Tucker and the clothes on his back. The insurance adjuster, a soft-handed man from Billings who wore a tie to walk through ash and rubble, had delivered the news with practiced sympathy. The policy would cover the buildings and some of the stock, but it wouldn't be enough to rebuild. Not at Silas's age, not with the cost of everything these days, and certainly not with the bank breathing down his neck about the mortgage that still had 8 years left on it. Might be time to think about retiring somewhere warmer, the adjuster had suggested, his clipboard already filled out with numbers that spelled the end of everything. Florida's real nice this time of year, but Silas Boone had never run from a hard winter, and he wasn't about to start now. The town of Clearwater had tried to help. Pastor Morrison from the Methodist Church had organized a collection, and folks had donated clothes and canned goods, and even offered their spare bedrooms. But charity, no matter how well-intentioned, sat poorly on a man who'd spent his whole life taking care of himself. Silas had stayed 3 nights in the church basement, listening to Tucker whine softly in the dark, before he'd packed up what little they had and headed back into the mountains. He'd been walking for 2 days when he found the cabin. It sat in a hollow between 2 ridges, maybe 15 miles from where his ranch had been, accessible only by an old logging road that was more rut than pavement. The Forest Service maps called it the Henderson Place, after the family that had homesteaded there in the 1890s, but the Hendersons had been gone for 30 years. And the cabin showed every day of that abandonment. The roof sagged in the middle, where a tree had fallen and been hauled away by someone who'd taken the valuable timber but left the damage. Windows were broken, their glass scattered in the weeds that grew up through the porch boards. The door hung crooked on leather hinges that had rotted through in places, and inside, pack rats and squirrels had made homes in the corners where the walls met the floor. But the foundation was solid river rock, laid by men who understood that some things were meant to last. The walls were chinked log, thick enough to keep out the cold, and the fireplace was built of the same stone as the foundation, with a chimney that drew true when Silas tested it with a handful of burning twigs. Most importantly, it was his for the taking. The Forest Service had a program for folks willing to restore abandoned homesteads, and Silas had qualified faster than he'd expected. A lifetime of mountain living and a reputation for honest work had opened doors that might have stayed closed for a younger man with less history. "What do you think, Tucker?" Silas had asked that first evening as they sat on the broken porch and watched the sun set between the pines. "Think we can make something of this old place?" Tucker had wagged his tail and laid his head on Silas's boot, which was answer enough. The first month had been about survival. Silas patched the roof with tarps and scrap lumber salvaged from the forest, enough to keep the snow out when the first storm hit in early October. He fixed the door and covered the broken windows with plywood until he could afford proper glass. He cleaned out the pack rat nests and mouse droppings, scrubbed the walls with lye soap, and built furniture from pine logs and determination. The work felt good. It reminded him of the early days with Sarah, when they'd lived in a trailer while building their first cabin, when every improvement had been an achievement worth celebrating. His hands, soft from too many weeks of feeling useless, grew calloused again. His back, which had started to ache from sleeping on church basement cots, straightened as he swung the axe and lifted the logs. Tucker had found his purpose again, too. The old cabin sat in prime hunting country, and the dog had appointed himself guardian against the deer that wanted to eat what few vegetables Silas could coax from the rocky soil. More than that, Tucker seemed to understand that this wasn't just shelter, it was hope taking shape one board at a time. By November, word had begun to spread. Mountain communities were small, and news traveled along with the mail and the occasional supply truck. People heard about the old man and his dog who'd taken on the Henderson place, and some of them came to see for themselves. The first visitor had been Johnny Reeves, a logger whose arthritis had forced him into early retirement. Johnny had heard about Silas from Pastor Morrison and had driven up the old logging road just to check on a fellow mountain man. He'd stayed for coffee and ended up helping Silas reinforce the porch before he left. "Place looks good," Johnny had said, loading his tools back into his truck. Him got the feel of home about it. That had been the beginning. The snow started falling on the second Tuesday in December, fat flakes that drifted down through the pines like pieces of torn paper. Silas stood at his newly installed window, watching the world turn white, when he heard the truck engine struggling up the logging road. Tucker's ears perked up from his place by the fire. But the dog didn't bark. He'd learned to distinguish between friendly visitors and trouble, and this sounded like the former. The truck that pulled into the clearing was older than Silas's burned pickup had been. Its blue paint faded to primer gray in places where rust had taken hold. The man who climbed out moved with the careful deliberation of someone carrying invisible weight, and when he turned toward the cabin, Silas could see why. The stranger was young, maybe 35, but his eyes held the hollow look of someone who'd seen too much. His left arm hung differently than his right, and when he walked, there was a hitch in his step that spoke of old injuries that hadn't healed quite right. He wore military surplus clothing that had seen better days, and his hair was regulation short, despite whatever had brought him out of uniform. "You, Silas Boone," the man called out, stopping at the bottom of the porch steps. "That's right," Silas replied, opening the door but staying on the threshold. "What can I do for you?" "Name's Marcus Webb. I heard about what you're doing up here, the rebuilding and all. Wondered if you could use some help." Silas studied the younger man's face, noting the tension around his eyes and the way his good hand stayed close to his hip, where a weapon might rest if he were the type to carry one. But there was something else there too, a kind of desperate hope that Silas recognized from his own mirror. "Depends what kind of help you're offering," Silas said, "and why you're offering it." Marcus shifted his weight, and for a moment his composure cracked. "Been driving around for 3 weeks now, trying to figure out where I belong. Somebody down in Clearwater said you might understand what it's like to start over from nothing." The honesty in those words hit Silas harder than he'd expected. He stepped back and opened the door wider. "Coffee's fresh. Come on in before you freeze to death." Inside the cabin, Marcus looked around with the eye of someone who understood construction. He noted the solid work Silas had done with limited materials, the way the chinking was tight and level, how the floor had been laid to account for the settling of the old foundation. "You do good work," Marcus said. Accepting the coffee cup with his good hand, "Had plenty of practice," Silas replied. "What brought you to my door, son?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee as if it might hold answers to questions he hadn't figured out how to ask. "Did 3 tours in Afghanistan. Came home to find my wife had moved on with someone who didn't wake up screaming in the middle of the night. Lost the house, lost the job, lost pretty much everything that mattered." Silas nodded. He'd known other men who'd come back from wars that never really ended, not in their heads anyway. "That why you're up here in the mountains?" "Partly. But I heard about this place from a guy at the VA hospital in Great Falls. Said there was an old man building something special up here, something for folks who needed a second chance." Silas frowned. "Don't recall saying anything about second chances to anybody. Maybe not in so many words," Marcus said. "But Johnny Reeves talks to people and people listen. Word is you're building more than just a cabin up here." That evening, after Marcus had helped Silas reinforce the cabin's west wall against the coming winter storms, the younger man pulled something from his truck. It was wrapped in an old army blanket, and when he unfolded it, Silas saw it was a wooden toolbox, handmade from what looked like walnut, with brass corners and a hand-carved nameplate that read Webb. "My grandfather made this," Marcus said, running his fingers over the smooth wood. "He was a carpenter, built half the houses in the county where I grew up. Always said a man's tools were the measure of his character." Silas examined the box, noting the fine joinery and the way the wood had been finished to bring out the grain. "Beautiful work. Your grandfather teach you the trade?" "Some. Enough to know good craftsmanship when I see it." Marcus gestured toward the cabin. "What you've done here, it's not just about shelter, is it?" Silas considered the question as he handed the toolbox back. "Every man needs a place to belong, I reckon. Some find it in cities, some find it in families. Some of us need to build it from scratch." "That's what I thought you might say," Marcus replied. "I'd like to stay and help if you'll have me. I've got some savings left, enough to buy my own supplies. And I work hard. Learned that much in the army. The snow was falling harder now, and Silas could see that Marcus's truck wasn't equipped for mountain winter driving. More than that, he could see the desperation the younger man was trying to hide, the same lost quality that had driven Silas himself up into these hills. "Got a spare room upstairs," Silas said finally. "Needs work, but it's warm enough. You can stay through the winter, help with the building. Come spring, we'll see how things sit." The relief that crossed Marcus's face was immediate and profound. "Thank you, sir. You won't regret this." But even as Marcus went to get his gear from the truck, Silas wondered if he was making a mistake. He'd come up here to rebuild his own life, not to take on someone else's problems. And there was something about Marcus, something held too tightly in check, that suggested the younger man's troubles might be more complicated than a simple case of bad luck. Tucker seemed to sense Silas's uncertainty. The dog had accepted Marcus easily enough, but now he stayed close to Silas's side, his brown eyes alert and watchful over the next few days. As the snow piled deeper and the wind howled through the pines, Silas began to understand why Marcus had sought him out. The younger man worked with the focused intensity of someone trying to outrun his own thoughts. He replaced broken floorboards with precision that spoke of military training, and he reinforced the cabin's frame with an engineer's understanding of stress and load-bearing. But at night, when the work was done and they sat by the fire with their coffee, Marcus would grow quiet and distant. Sometimes Silas would hear him pacing in the upstairs room, and once he'd heard what sounded like muffled crying. "War don't let go easy," Silas observed one evening. After Marcus had spent the day working in almost complete silence, Marcus looked up from the piece of wood he'd been sanding smooth. "You ever lose sleep over things you can't change?" "Every night for the first year after Sarah died," Silas admitted. "Kept thinking if I'd made her go to the doctor sooner, or if I'd insisted on different treatments. But regret's a heavy load to carry, son. Eventually you got to set it down, or it'll break your back." "Some things can't be set down," Marcus said quietly. Silas studied the younger man's profile in the firelight, noting the tension in his jaw and the way his hands never quite stopped moving. "Maybe not, but they can be worked through. Takes time, and it takes honest labor, and sometimes it takes friends who understand the weight." That night, for the first time since Marcus had arrived, the upstairs room was quiet, and in the morning Silas found his new housemate already at work, building something that looked like it might become a second cabin, smaller than the main house but solid and well-planned. "Figure if this place is going to be a haven for lost souls," Marcus said when Silas asked about the project. "We're going to need more room." It was then that Silas understood what was really happening on his mountain. He hadn't just found a place to rebuild his own life. He'd stumbled onto something much larger and more important. And Marcus Webb, with his damaged body and his grandfather's toolbox, was the first sign that his quiet sanctuary was about to become something neither of them had planned. By January, the second cabin was taking real shape. Marcus worked with the methodical precision of a man who found peace in the rhythm of saw and hammer, and Silas began to understand that his unexpected guest was more than just a troubled veteran. He was a craftsman with an eye for detail that matched his grandfather's legacy. The morning brought news that would test both men's resolve. Pastor Morrison's truck came grinding up the snowy logging road, its chains biting into the ice with a sound like breaking glass. The pastor didn't make social calls this far up the mountain in winter, which meant whatever brought him was serious. "Silas," Pastor Morrison called out as he climbed from his truck, his breath forming clouds in the bitter air. "We need to talk." Inside the cabin, the pastor accepted coffee with hands that shook slightly, not from cold, but from whatever burden he'd carried up the mountain. He was a thin man with kind eyes and the sort of quiet strength that came from 30 years of helping people through their worst moments. "There's a girl down in town," he said without preamble. "Anna Fitzgerald, 16 years old, lost her parents in a car accident 3 months ago. Been staying with her aunt, but that's not working out." Silas exchanged glances with Marcus, who had been listening from the kitchen area while cleaning his tools. "What's that got to do with us, Pastor?" "Anna's been in trouble since the accident. Running away, getting into fights, won't go to school. Her aunt says she can't handle her anymore, wants to send her to state care." Pastor Morrison set down his coffee cup with deliberate care. "But I've been watching this girl, and I don't think she's bad. I think she's broken, and she needs some place to heal." Marcus stepped forward, his expression guarded. "You're asking us to take in a teenage girl? We're not exactly qualified to—" "You're building something up here," the pastor interrupted gently. "Word's gotten around about what you two have accomplished. People are talking about the peace they feel when they visit this place. Anna needs that peace." Silas stood and walked to the window, looking out at the half-finished second cabin. Snow clung to its exposed beams like nature's blessing on honest work. "Pastor, I appreciate what you think we're doing here, but taking care of a troubled teenager is different than helping grown men find their footing." "Is it?" Pastor Morrison asked. "Seems to me broken is broken. Whether you're 16 or 60, the artifact that would change everything sat on the pastor's lap, a worn leather journal with Anna's name embossed on the cover in faded gold letters. He held it out to Silas with the reverence of a man handling something precious. Her mother gave her this journal for her 15th birthday. Anna's been writing in it since the accident, poems mostly, and stories about the mountains. Her aunt found it and brought it to me, worried about some of the things Anna had written." Pastor Morrison opened the journal to a page marked with a ribbon. "Read this." Silas took the journal and read the page silently, his weathered face growing thoughtful. The writing was in a young woman's careful script. "I dreamed about the mountains again last night. There was an old cabin where broken things went to become whole. A place where the wind didn't carry whispers of loss, where the silence was peaceful instead of empty. I think if I could find that place, I might remember how to breathe without it hurting. She wrote that 2 weeks ago," Pastor Morrison said, "before she'd ever heard about you or this place." Marcus moved closer, reading over Silas's shoulder. His own experience with loss made the words hit deep. "She's running from the same ghosts we all are." Silas closed the journal carefully, his fingers tracing the worn leather cover. He thought about Sarah, about the way grief could eat at a person from the inside. He thought about Marcus, pacing the floors at night, trying to walk away from memories that followed him everywhere. And he thought about himself, how this mountain refuge had become his salvation when everything else had turned to ash. "Where is she now?" Silas asked finally. "Staying at the church temporarily. Her aunt's given her until the end of the week to find somewhere else to go. Or she's calling social services." The three men sat in silence for a moment, listening to the wind in the pines and the crackle of the fire. Tucker raised his head from his place by the hearth, as if sensing the weight of the decision being made. "She'd need her own space," Marcus said suddenly. "A place that's hers, where she can have some privacy but still be part of—" He gestured around the cabin. "Whatever this is becoming," Silas nodded slowly. "The old root cellar behind the main cabin. It's got good stone walls and a separate entrance. Could be converted into a small apartment with some work." "You're both talking like this is already decided," Pastor Morrison observed, though there was hope in his voice. "Maybe it is," Silas replied. "But there'd have to be rules. School chores, no running off without telling someone where she's going. And she'd have to want to be here. I won't force help on someone who doesn't want it." Pastor Morrison smiled for the first time since arriving. "I think you'll find Anna wants to be here more than anywhere else. But she's going to test you both, probably more than once. Grief makes people do things they wouldn't normally do, especially when they're young and scared." Over the next 2 days, Silas and Marcus worked to prepare a space for Anna. The root cellar was larger than it had appeared from outside, with thick stone walls that would keep it cool in summer and warm in winter. They installed a wood-burning stove, built simple furniture from pine logs, and created a sleeping area that was private but connected to the main cabin through a covered walkway. Marcus proved to be especially thoughtful about the details. He carved a simple wooden sign that read Anna's Place and hung it by the door. He built shelves for books and personal items, understanding instinctively that a teenage girl would need space to claim as her own. "You think we're doing the right thing?" Marcus asked on the second evening, as they put the finishing touches on what was becoming a remarkably cozy small apartment. Silas considered the question while he tested the drawer on the newly installed stove. "Don't know if there's a right thing or a wrong thing in a situation like this. But I know what it feels like to lose everything and need a place to start over. If we can give her that chance," he shrugged. "Seems like the Christian thing to do, even if she brings trouble with her." "Son, trouble's been following both of us for a while now. Maybe having someone else to look after will do us all some good." That night, Silas sat by his own fire with Anna's journal open in his lap, reading her words about finding peace in the mountains. He thought about the strange turn his life had taken, from solitary rebuilding to creating what was beginning to feel like a family. It wasn't what he'd planned when he'd first discovered the abandoned cabin, but maybe that was the point. Sometimes the best things came from saying yes to possibilities you'd never imagined. Anna Fitzgerald arrived on a Thursday morning in late January, riding in Pastor Morrison's truck with everything she owned, packed into 2 cardboard boxes and a duffel bag that had seen better days. She was smaller than Silas had expected, barely 5 feet tall, with auburn hair that hung across her face like a curtain she could hide behind. When she climbed out of the truck, her movements were careful and guarded, like an animal testing unfamiliar ground. She carried with her an object that would become central to her healing, a battered acoustic guitar with a cracked soundboard and strings that buzzed when she played. It had been her father's, Pastor Morrison explained quietly, while Anna stood apart, studying the cabins with eyes that missed nothing. "Anna," Silas said gently, approaching her as he would a spooked horse. "I'm Silas, and this is Marcus. Welcome to our home." She looked up at him then, and he saw Sarah in her eyes, not the physical resemblance, but the same stubborn intelligence and carefully hidden vulnerability that had drawn him to his wife all those years ago. Anna's eyes were green where Sarah's had been brown, but they held the same capacity for both trust and defiance. "Pastor Morrison says you read my journal," she said, her voice carrying an edge of accusation. "That wasn't meant for strangers." "No, I don't imagine it was," Silas replied. "But sometimes our private thoughts find their way to people who need to hear them. Your words about finding peace in the mountains, they reminded me why I came up here myself." Anna shifted the guitar to her other arm, her fingers automatically finding the neck in a gesture that spoke of countless hours of practice. "I'm not some charity case, if that's what you think. I can take care of myself." "I'm sure you can," Marcus said, stepping forward. "But taking care of yourself and having a place to belong aren't the same thing. Trust me on that." Something in his tone made Anna look at him more carefully, taking in the way he favored his left side and the careful way he moved. She recognized damage when she saw it. They were alike in that way, marked by losses that showed in how they carried themselves. "I wrote those things before I knew this place existed," she said, gesturing toward the cabins. "How did you know? Sometimes the mountains call to people who need them," Silas said simply. "Doesn't matter much how or why, long as you answer when they do." Pastor Morrison helped carry Anna's belongings to her new space, and Silas watched her face carefully as she saw what they'd prepared for her. The reaction was immediate but quickly hidden, a flash of something that might have been gratitude before her defenses slammed back into place. "It's temporary," she said, setting her guitar carefully in the corner. "I'll be 18 in 2 years, and then I can go wherever I want." "Course you can," Silas agreed. "But until then, you're welcome here as long as you follow a few simple rules." Anna crossed her arms, waiting for the list of restrictions she was sure would come. Instead, Silas surprised her. "Rule 1, you go to school. Education matters, and your parents would want you to finish what you started. Rule 2, you do your share of the work around here. Nothing fancy, just help with cooking and cleaning and whatever projects we're working on. Rule 3, You tell someone where you're going if you leave the property. Not asking permission, just courtesy so we don't worry. That's it? Anna asked, suspicion clear in her voice. That's it. Oh, and rule 4. You're welcome at our table every night for dinner, and we'd like you to come. But that's more invitation than rule. After Pastor Morrison left, Anna spent the rest of the day moving around the property like she was mapping escape routes. She tested the boundaries, wandering to the edge of the clearing and back, always keeping the cabins in sight. Marcus and Silas watched her from a distance, giving her space to adjust, while making sure she knew they were there. That evening, she surprised them both by showing up for dinner. She sat quietly, while Silas and Marcus talked about their plans for expanding the workshop space. But when Marcus mentioned needing to repair his truck's starter, she spoke up. I know about engines, she said. My dad taught me. We used to work on cars together in his garage. It was the first personal thing she'd shared, and both men were careful not to make too much of it. But when Marcus asked if she'd mind taking a look at the truck the next day, she nodded with something that almost looked like eagerness. The breakthrough came 3 days later. Silas was working alone in the main cabin, reinforcing a beam that had been weakened by years of weather, when he heard guitar music coming from Anna's space. He paused in his work, listening to the melody that drifted across the cold air, something sad and beautiful that spoke of loss and longing. When the music stopped, he found an excuse to walk past her door. Anna was sitting on her small porch despite the cold, the guitar across her lap, and tears on her cheeks that she didn't bother to hide. That was beautiful, Silas said simply. Anna looked up, startled. She'd thought she was alone. It was my dad's favorite song. He used to play it for my mom when he thought I wasn't listening. Would you play it again? I'd like to hear it properly. For a moment he thought she might refuse. Then she positioned the guitar and began to play, this time singing softly along with the melody. Her voice was clear and strong, trained by someone who understood music, and the song filled the winter air with warmth that had nothing to do with temperature. When she finished, Silas was quiet for a moment. Your father taught you well. Music like that, it's healing for the person playing it and the people listening. He said music was one of the ways people talk to God, Anna said, her fingers still moving absently on the strings. Said it was prayer you could hear. Smart man, your father. Anna nodded, and for the first time since she'd arrived, her defenses seemed to relax slightly. He was, they both were. I don't know how to be me without them. That's something you'll figure out in your own time, Silas said. But you don't have to figure it out alone. That night, for the first time since her arrival, Anna joined them by the fire in the main cabin. She brought her guitar, and when Marcus asked about her parents, she found herself talking about them, small stories at first, then larger ones, as if the words had been waiting for a safe place to emerge. By the time they all went to bed, something had shifted. The careful distance Anna had maintained was beginning to dissolve, replaced by the first tentative threads of trust. And Silas realized that in trying to help a broken teenager heal, they'd all taken another step toward becoming the family none of them had known they needed. Spring came early to the mountains that year, bringing with it the sound of snowmelt rushing down the creek and the first tentative green of new growth. It also brought unexpected visitors and challenges that would test the foundation of what Silas, Marcus, and Anna were building together. The first sign of change arrived with Dr. Elena Vasquez, a psychiatrist from the VA hospital in Great Falls. She drove up the logging road in a sensible sedan that looked out of place among the pines, carrying with her a leather medical bag that had belonged to her grandfather, a country doctor who had served mountain communities for 40 years. The bag was worn smooth by decades of use, its brass clasps tarnished but still functional, and it contained not just medical supplies, but also handwritten notes from her grandfather about treating the whole person, not just their symptoms. I'm looking for Marcus Webb, she said when Silas answered the door. He's missed his last 3 appointments. And his caseworker is concerned. Silas studied the woman on his porch, mid-40s, with graying black hair and intelligent dark eyes that took in the improvements to the cabin with professional assessment. She didn't look like the typical government official who usually came calling about missed appointments. "Marcus is working," Silas said carefully. "But I'll get him for you." Marcus emerged from the workshop he'd been building behind the second cabin, wiping sawdust from his hands and wearing the expression of a man who'd been expecting this conversation for weeks. Dr. Vasquez's presence clearly unsettled him, but he met her gaze directly. "Doc," he said with a nod, "I figured you'd track me down eventually. Your caseworker wanted to send the police," Dr. Vasquez replied. "I convinced her to let me come instead. May we talk?" What followed was a conversation that laid bare the complexity of Marcus's situation. The VA had been treating him for PTSD and depression, but the medications made him feel disconnected from himself, and the group therapy sessions felt like performance rather than healing. He'd stopped going because he'd found something better: purpose, community, and work that made him feel whole again. "I understand the appeal of this place," Dr. Vasquez said, looking around at the peaceful clearing where Anna sat on her porch, tuning her guitar, while Tucker dozed in the afternoon sun. "But you can't just disappear from treatment, Marcus. There are protocols, evaluations that need to be completed. What if the treatment isn't helping?" Marcus asked. "What if I'm doing better here than I ever did in your offices?" Dr. Vasquez opened her grandfather's medical bag and pulled out a notebook filled with careful observations. She'd been watching Marcus during their conversation, noting his posture, his eye contact, the steadiness in his voice that had been absent during their sessions in Great Falls. "You do seem different," she admitted, "more grounded. But I need to understand what's happening here before I can recommend any changes to your treatment plan." That conversation led to the most unusual psychiatric evaluation in Dr. Vasquez's career. Instead of sitting in a sterile office, answering questions about sleep patterns and anxiety levels, Marcus showed her the work he'd been doing, the cabins he'd helped build, the workshop where he created furniture with the same precision and care his grandfather had put into that toolbox. He introduced her to Silas and Anna, explaining how their informal family had formed around shared loss and the healing power of honest work. Anna proved to be unexpectedly articulate about the changes she'd witnessed in Marcus. "When he first got here, he couldn't sleep," she told Dr. Vasquez. "I could hear him pacing at night, and sometimes he'd be working on projects at 3 in the morning because he couldn't stand being still. But now he sleeps through the night, and when he works, it's because he wants to create something, not because he's running from his thoughts." Dr. Vasquez spent 3 days at the mountain refuge, officially conducting her evaluation, but actually experiencing something she'd never encountered in traditional treatment settings. She saw Marcus teaching Anna advanced woodworking techniques, his patience with her mistakes, demonstrating a gentleness that trauma hadn't destroyed. She watched Silas treat Marcus not as a damaged veteran, but as a valued partner in building something meaningful. And she observed how all 3 of them had created a routine of shared meals, evening conversations, and collaborative work that addressed the isolation and purposelessness that fueled so much psychological distress. On her final evening, Dr. Vasquez sat with them around the fire in the main cabin, her grandfather's medical bag at her feet. "I need to ask you something," she said to Marcus. "Are you opposed to all treatment, or just the treatment you were receiving?" Marcus considered the question carefully. "I'm not opposed to getting help, but the help I was getting felt like it was trying to fix me so I could go back to being who I was before. I don't want to be who I was before. I want to be who I'm becoming here." Dr. Vasquez nodded slowly. "What if we could design a treatment approach that supported who you're becoming rather than trying to restore who you were?" What emerged from that conversation was revolutionary in its simplicity. Instead of requiring Marcus to return to Great Falls for regular appointments, Dr. Vasquez proposed monthly visits to the mountain refuge, where she could observe his progress in the environment where he was actually healing. She would work with him to develop coping strategies that built on the stability he'd found rather than the instability he'd left behind. "This is highly irregular," she warned them, "and I'll need to document everything carefully to justify the approach to my supervisors. But I've seen more genuine progress in 3 days here than in 6 months of traditional therapy." The arrangement also extended to Anna, who had been avoiding the grief counseling Pastor Morrison had arranged for her in town. Dr. Vasquez recognized that the teenager was processing her loss through music, community, and the gradual rebuilding of trust, methods that were working far better than talk therapy had. "You've created something special here," Dr. Vasquez told Silas as she prepared to leave. "But you need to understand that word is going to spread. Other people are going to hear about what you're doing and want to be part of it." Silas looked around at the small community they'd built. The cabins nestled among the pines, the workshop where Marcus created beautiful things from raw wood, the small garden plot where Anna had announced her intention to grow vegetables. It was still small enough that he knew every board they'd nailed, every problem they'd solved together. "Is that a warning or a promise?" he asked. Dr. Vasquez smiled as she climbed into her sedan. "Both," she said. "Definitely both." Dr. Vasquez's prediction proved accurate sooner than anyone expected. By late spring, the mountain refuge had begun attracting attention from people who had heard whispers of an old man and his unconventional family who were building something extraordinary in the wilderness. The first to arrive was Dolores Chen, a 72-year-old widow who drove up the logging road in a pristine 1987 Buick that her late husband had maintained with religious devotion. She carried with her a small wooden recipe box, painted robin's egg blue and filled with index cards written in careful cursive. The box had belonged to her mother, then her grandmother before that, containing not just recipes, but the accumulated wisdom of 3 generations of women who had known how to feed both body and soul. More than recipes, it represented Dolores's fear that she had become invisible in a world that no longer valued the knowledge she carried. "I heard about this place from my grandson," Dolores explained to Silas as she stood beside her car, looking uncertainly at the cluster of cabins. "He works at the VA hospital, said there was a doctor coming up here to see a veteran who was doing better than anybody expected. I thought maybe—" She paused, gathering courage. "My Arthur passed 2 years ago, and I've been rattling around our house ever since, feeling like I don't have purpose anymore." Silas saw something familiar in her careful dignity and the way she held herself, the same blend of strength and uncertainty that had brought Marcus and Anna to his door. "What kind of purpose were you thinking about, Mrs. Chen?" "I can cook," she said simply. "Real cooking, not just heating up frozen dinners. And I know about gardens, about preserving food, about keeping a house running smooth. Your Anna mentioned to Pastor Morrison that you folks have been eating out of cans and making do with simple meals. Seems like maybe I could help with that." The integration of Dolores into their small community proved both easier and more complex than anyone had anticipated. She took over the main cabin's kitchen with the quiet authority of someone who had been feeding people for 50 years. Transforming their simple meals into elaborate affairs that filled the space with aromas Silas hadn't experienced since Sarah's death. But more than that, she brought a different kind of wisdom, the accumulated knowledge of a woman who had raised 5 children, buried her parents and her husband, and learned how to find joy in small daily rituals. Anna responded to Dolores with a hunger that surprised everyone, including herself. The older woman became the maternal presence Anna hadn't realized she'd been missing, teaching her not just cooking techniques, but the subtle art of creating home through care and attention to detail. They spent hours together in the kitchen, Dolores sharing stories, while Anna learned to knead bread and season soup with instincts passed down through generations. "My mother always said cooking was a way of loving people," Dolores told Anna one afternoon as they prepared dinner for the growing household. "Every meal is a chance to say, 'I care about you,' without having to find the words." But Dolores's presence also highlighted the challenges they would face as their community grew. She needed her own living space, but was too proud to accept charity, insisting on paying rent even though Silas had no intention of charging her. Marcus solved the problem by designing a small addition to the main cabin, a private apartment with its own entrance, but connected to the main kitchen so Dolores could cook for everyone without feeling like a guest. The work on Dolores's apartment brought a new rhythm to their days. Marcus handled the construction with Anna as his assistant, while Dolores managed the household and Silas worked on longer-term planning for what was clearly becoming a permanent community. The recipe box sat on the kitchen counter like a talisman, its blue paint brightened by daily use as Dolores prepared meals that turned eating into celebration. Dr. Vasquez returned for her second monthly visit to find the refuge transformed. The addition was nearly complete. The garden had been expanded under Dolores's guidance, and the dynamics of the group had shifted to accommodate a fourth member who brought different needs and different gifts. "This is accelerating faster than I expected," Dr. Vasquez observed to Silas during a private conversation. "Are you prepared for what happens when word really gets out about what you're doing here?" Silas had been wrestling with that question himself. What had started as personal rebuilding had become something much larger, and he wasn't sure he understood the implications. "Feels like we're being carried along by something bigger than ourselves," he admitted. "Like maybe this was always meant to happen, and we're just now catching up to the plan." The plan, whatever it was, revealed itself further when Johnny Reeves, the arthritic logger who had been Silas's first visitor, returned with news that would test their growing community's resilience. "County's been asking questions about what you're doing up here," Johnny reported over one of Dolores's elaborate dinners. "Some folks in town are saying good things, but others are worried about building codes and permits. But whether you're running some kind of unlicensed care facility." Anna looked up from her plate, alarm clear in her green eyes. "What does that mean? Could they make us leave?" "Nobody's talking about making anybody leave," Johnny assured her. "But they want to understand what this place is. Whether it's a family situation or something that needs to be regulated." Marcus set down his fork carefully. "Are we talking about inspections? Official visits?" "Probably," Johnny said. "And the sooner you get ahead of it, the better. Because right now you're operating in a gray area, and gray areas make bureaucrats nervous." That night, after Dolores had retired to her new apartment and Anna had gone to practice guitar in her space, Silas and Marcus sat by the fire discussing their options. The refuge had grown organically, shaped by need and intuition rather than planning and regulations. But they were reaching a point where their informal arrangements might not be sufficient to protect what they'd built. "We could apply for non-profit status," Marcus suggested. "Make it official, a retreat center or something like that. That would mean paperwork, oversight, rules about who can stay and for how long," Silas replied. "Might take the heart out of what makes this place work. But if we don't do something official, we might lose it entirely." Silas stared into the fire, thinking about Sarah and the dreams they'd built together, about the strange path that had led him from those ashes to this new kind of family. "Maybe the answer isn't to make it official," he said finally. "Maybe the answer is to make it so obviously good that nobody wants to interfere with it." Outside, a spring storm was building in the mountains, bringing with it the kind of change that couldn't be planned for or controlled, only weathered with faith that what they'd built was strong enough to endure. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in early June, delivered by a county official who looked deeply uncomfortable as he handed it to Silas. The envelope bore the seal of the Montana Department of Health and Human Services, and its contents would shatter everything they thought they understood about their mountain refuge. Inside, along with the expected notices about building permits and care facility regulations, was a second document that made Silas's hands shake as he read it. It was a property deed, not to the Henderson place, which he'd been legally restoring, but to an adjacent tract of land that included the natural spring that supplied their water and the meadow where they'd planned to expand their gardens. The deed was in Sarah's name. "That's impossible," Silas whispered, reading the document again. Sarah never owned any land up here? We looked at this property once, years ago, but decided we couldn't afford it. But the signature was unmistakably hers. And the date was 3 months before her death, when she'd been making frequent trips to town for her cancer treatments. Trips she'd insisted on making alone because she didn't want Silas to see her weakness. Anna found him sitting on the porch an hour later, the deed spread across his knees and tears streaming down his weathered face. Tucker pressed against his leg, sensing his master's distress, while Silas stared at the meadow that Sarah had somehow, impossibly purchased for him. "What's wrong?" Anna asked, settling beside him with the careful gentleness she'd learned to use when any of them were struggling with their ghosts. Silas handed her the deed, his voice rough when he spoke. "Sarah bought this land while she was dying. Used money from her father's estate that I didn't even know she still had. Never told me about it, never gave me any hint that she was thinking about expanding up here." Anna studied the document, her young mind quickly grasping the implications. "But this is good news, isn't it? It means you own more land than you thought. It means nobody can force you to stop using the spring or the meadow. It means my wife was planning for my future while she was dying, and I was too blind to see it," Silas said. "She knew I'd need this place someday, knew I'd need room to build something bigger than just a cabin for myself." Marcus emerged from the workshop, drawn by the sound of their voices, and read the deed with the careful attention of someone who understood legal documents. "There's more," he said, pointing to a clause Silas hadn't noticed. "She established a trust. The land can't be sold or developed. It has to be used for the healing of souls who find their way to the mountains." The phrase was so quintessentially Sarah that Silas felt her presence as surely as if she were sitting beside him. She'd always had a way with words, a poet's understanding of how language could capture truth that facts alone couldn't convey. But the greatest shock was yet to come. Attached to the deed was a sealed envelope with Silas's name, written in Sarah's careful script. Inside was a letter that would reframe everything he thought he knew about their marriage and her death. "My dearest Silas, if you're reading this, it means you've found your way to the mountains and discovered the gift I tried to leave for you. I'm writing this while you're asleep in the chair beside my hospital bed, still believing the doctors when they say there might be more time. We both know better. I've watched you these past months, seen how my dying has been killing you too. You think you're losing everything when I go, but I need you to understand something important. You're not losing everything. You're being prepared for something greater. Do you remember that day we drove up to look at the Henderson place? You said it was too far from everything, too isolated, but I saw how your face changed when you stood in that clearing. You looked like you were coming home to a place you'd never been before. I knew then that someday you'd need that peace, that isolation, that sense of starting over in a place where God's hand was still visible in the trees and stones. I bought the adjacent land because I could see your future more clearly than you could. I saw you rebuilding not just buildings but lives, your own and others, who would find their way to you. The trust language isn't legal poetry, my love. It's prophecy. You're going to resist this at first. You're going to think you're too old, too set in your ways, too broken by grief to become what you're meant to be. But grief doesn't break us, Silas. It breaks us open. And what pours out is usually bigger and more generous than what we contained before. There will be people who need what you're building. Not just shelter, but purpose. Not just a place to stay, but a place to become. Trust them and trust yourself. And trust that love doesn't end with death. It just finds new ways to work in the world. Build something beautiful on that land, my darling. Build something that would make me proud. All my love, always, Sarah P.S. Check the safety deposit box at First National. There's more where this came from. The letter hit Silas like a physical blow, not because it revealed Sarah's deception, but because it revealed the depth of her faith in him. While he'd been focused on her dying, she'd been planning for his living. While he'd been mourning the end of their story, she'd been writing the beginning of his next chapter. Anna was the first to speak. "She knew," she said softly. Somehow she knew that Marcus and I and Mrs. Chen would all end up here. She planned for all of us. Marcus nodded slowly, understanding dawning in his expression. The refuge isn't just something that happened by accident. It's something she made possible before any of us even knew we needed it. Dolores emerged from the kitchen, drawn by their voices, and listened in silence as they explained the letter and the deed. When they finished, she was quiet for a long moment before speaking. My Arthur used to say that some people are given second chances, and some people are given the gift of providing second chances to others, she said. Sounds like your Sarah knew which kind of person you were, even if you didn't. That afternoon, they drove to town together. The first time all four of them had left the mountain refuge at the same time. At First National Bank, the safety deposit box yielded another surprise. Enough money to not only complete the refuge's expansion, but to establish it as a legitimate non-profit organization with proper facilities and legal protection. Sarah had been thorough in her planning. There were architectural drawings for additional cabins, sketches for a common building that could serve as both dining hall and community center, and detailed notes about sustainable building practices that would allow the refuge to be mostly self-sufficient. She'd even included contact information for contractors and suppliers who specialized in eco-friendly construction. She thought of everything, Marcus marveled, looking through the carefully organized documents. It's like she drew up a blueprint for our future. But perhaps the most profound revelation was a small notebook filled with Sarah's observations about healing and community. She'd been researching therapeutic communities, sustainable living practices, and alternative approaches to mental health treatment, all while battling cancer and keeping her plans secret from her husband. True healing happens in community, she'd written. Not because community solves our problems, but because it gives us purpose beyond our problems. When we care for others, we remember who we are beneath our wounds. As they drove back up the mountain that evening, Silas felt something shift inside him. The refuge was no longer just a place he'd stumbled into. It was a calling Sarah had prepared him for, a destiny she'd seen more clearly than he had. The land deed wasn't just a legal document. It was a love letter written in real estate and trust funds, a final gift from a woman who'd understood that love's greatest expression wasn't in holding on, but in letting go towards something larger. That night, they spread Sarah's architectural drawings across Dolores's kitchen table and began planning not just for their own healing, but for the healing of the many lost souls who would eventually find their way to the mountains. The refuge was about to become something none of them had imagined, but something Sarah had always known was possible. The discovery of Sarah's plans set in motion a summer of intense preparation that would test every bond they'd formed and every lesson they'd learned about building community from broken pieces. With the architectural drawings as their guide and Sarah's trust fund as their foundation, they began the most ambitious expansion of the mountain refuge, but they also attracted the attention of forces that would challenge everything they'd created. The artifact that would anchor this crucial period was Sarah's leather-bound planning journal, filled with her careful handwriting and detailed sketches of her vision for the refuge. Silas carried it with him everywhere, consulting it like a sacred text as they prepared to transform his wife's dreams into reality. The first challenge came from an unexpected source. Anna's aunt, Rebecca Fitzgerald, arrived unannounced on a humid July morning, stepping out of a rental car with the determined stride of someone who'd come to reclaim what she considered hers. She was a sharp-featured woman in her 50s, dressed in city clothes that looked foreign among the pines, and she carried herself with the brittle confidence of someone who was used to getting her way through persistence rather than charm. "Anna!" she called out before she'd even reached the porch. "Pack your things. This little adventure is over." Anna emerged from the workshop where she'd been helping Marcus install windows in what would become the new dining hall, her face immediately closing down with the defensive wariness Silas hadn't seen since her first weeks at the refuge. "Aunt Rebecca," Anna said carefully, What are you doing here? I'm doing what I should have done months ago, bringing you home where you belong. I've been talking to lawyers, and they tell me this arrangement isn't legal. You're a minor living with unrelated adults in an unlicensed facility. It's time to fix this mistake. Silas felt his jaw tighten as he approached the group that was forming in the clearing. Anna looking trapped, Marcus wearing the expression of a man preparing for conflict, and Dolores emerging from the kitchen with flour still dusting her hands. Tucker positioned himself between Anna and her aunt, a low growl rumbling in his chest. "Ma'am," Silas said, his voice carefully controlled. "Anna's been doing well here. She's going to school, she's learning skills, she's part of our family now." Rebecca Fitzgerald's laugh was sharp and dismissive. "Family? You're strangers who took in a traumatized child without any legal authority. Anna has a real family, and I'm it." "You didn't want me," Anna said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of old wounds. "You said I was too much trouble, that you couldn't handle me. I said I needed time to adjust to having a teenager in my house," Rebecca replied. "But I've made arrangements now. There's a boarding school in Denver that specializes in grief counseling, and I've already paid the enrollment fee." The next hour was a battle fought with legal documents and raised voices, with Anna caught in the middle, looking smaller and more vulnerable than she had since her first day at the refuge. Rebecca had come prepared with court papers, granting her temporary guardianship and a social worker who'd agreed to accompany her for the child welfare evaluation. But as the argument escalated, something remarkable happened. The community that had formed around shared healing began to defend itself with the same quiet strength that had built it. Dolores invited the social worker into the kitchen for coffee and homemade cookies, subtly demonstrating the warm, nurturing environment Anna had found. Marcus produced documentation of Anna's improved school attendance and grades, along with letters from teachers praising her increased engagement and stability. Most importantly, Inda herself found her voice in a way that surprised everyone, including herself. "I want to stay," she said firmly, interrupting her aunt's litany of reasons why the arrangement was unsuitable. "I'm not the same person I was when my parents died. Here, I remember how to be happy. I remember how to trust people. I remember how to hope for things." She pulled out her father's guitar and began to play, right there in the clearing with the social worker and her aunt watching. The song was something she'd been working on, a melody that captured both loss and renewal, words about finding home in unexpected places. "I was broken when I came here, shattered like glass on stone, but piece by piece they helped me remember I wasn't alone. This mountain holds my healing, these people hold my heart, and I won't let anybody tear that gift apart." The music hung in the summer air like a prayer, and even Rebecca seemed momentarily affected by the raw emotion in her niece's voice. But she recovered quickly, her determination hardening rather than softening. "Music is lovely, Anna, but it's not going to provide for your future. You need proper education, proper preparation for college, proper guidance from qualified adults." Dr. Vasquez arrived at that moment, making her monthly visit just as the conflict reached its peak. Her presence shifted the entire dynamic, introducing professional credibility into what had been looking like an emotional standoff. "Ms. Fitzgerald," Dr. Vasquez said, after Rebecca had explained her position, "I understand your concerns, but I need to share some information about Anna's treatment progress." What followed was a careful, professional presentation of Anna's psychological evaluation and the remarkable improvements she'd shown since living at the refuge. Dr. Vasquez spoke about trauma-informed care, about the importance of stability and attachment in adolescent development, and about the measurable benefits Anna had gained from being part of a chosen family rather than an institutional setting. "The boarding school you've selected is excellent for many students," Dr. Vasquez concluded. "But for Anna, who has already experienced profound disruption and loss, removing her from a stable, nurturing environment could undo months of healing progress." The social worker, a middle-aged woman named Janet Mills, who had clearly seen too many placement decisions go wrong, was taking careful notes throughout the conversation. When she spoke, her voice carried the authority of someone who understood the difference between what looked right on paper and what actually worked for children. "I'm going to need to do a full evaluation of this placement," she said to Rebecca. "That means interviewing all the adults, reviewing the living situation, checking references, and most importantly, conducting extensive interviews with Anna about her preferences and well-being." The evaluation process took 3 days, during which the entire refuge operated under intense scrutiny. Janet Mills proved to be thorough but fair, recognizing genuine care when she saw it. She interviewed Anna extensively, both in private and in group settings, documenting not just her emotional state, but her practical development, her improved academic performance, her growing confidence, her healthy relationships with the adults who'd become her chosen family. She also spoke with Pastor Morrison, who provided context about Anna's condition when she'd first arrived, and with teachers at the local school who confirmed the dramatic positive changes in Anna's engagement and behavior. But the most powerful testimony came from Anna herself, who had prepared a written statement about her life at the refuge. "Before I came here, I felt like a ghost in my own life. I was angry all the time, but underneath the anger was just emptiness. I didn't know how to be around people anymore. Didn't know how to trust that anyone would stay in my life without leaving or dying or giving up on me." Silas. Marcus and Dolores didn't try to fix me or replace my parents or pretend that my pain wasn't real. They just made room for me to exist while I figured out how to live again. They taught me that family isn't just about blood. It's about people who choose to love you even when you're difficult, even when you're scared, even when you don't know how to love yourself. "If you take me away from here, you're not saving me. You're breaking me all over again." On the third evening, as the evaluation neared its conclusion, Rebecca made one final attempt to assert her authority. She found Silas alone on the porch, where he often sat with Sarah's planning journal, sketching modifications to her designs. "You seem like a decent man," she said, settling uninvited in the chair beside him. "But you have to understand, Anna is my responsibility. Her parents would have wanted her with family." Silas looked up from the journal, his weathered hands still holding the pencil he'd been using to add details to Sarah's architectural drawings. "With respect, ma'am, I think Anna's parents would have wanted her to be loved and safe and given the chance to become who she's meant to be. That's what we're trying to give her here. And what happens when she's 18 and moves on? What happens when you get older and can't take care of her anymore? What happens when this little experiment falls apart?" Silas considered the questions seriously because they were the same ones that kept him awake some nights. "I can't promise everything will always be perfect," he said finally. "But I can promise that as long as I'm drawing breath, Anna will have a place where she belongs. And if something happens to me, Marcus and Dolores feel the same way. We're not just a temporary arrangement. We're a family that chose each other." The next morning brought Janet Mills's decision, delivered with the careful language of someone who understood the weight of her words. Anna could remain at the refuge, provided that certain conditions were met regarding educational oversight and regular check-ins with child welfare services. Rebecca had legal grounds to challenge the decision, but Janet Mills's recommendation carried significant weight with family court judges. Rebecca left that afternoon, angry and defeated, but not entirely without understanding. In her final conversation with Anna, she said something that surprised everyone. "I hope you're right about this place. I hope it gives you what I couldn't." As her rental car disappeared down the mountain road, the refuge felt simultaneously more secure and more fragile than ever. They had won the right to continue building their unconventional family, but the scrutiny had revealed how much they still had to do to ensure their community's survival. The real test was just beginning. August brought the crisis that would test everything they'd built. It arrived in the form of a wildfire that started in the national forest 30 miles south of their mountain refuge, driven by unprecedented drought and howling winds that pushed the flames toward communities that had never faced such devastation. The artifact that would define this climactic period was Silas's old firefighting helmet, scarred by decades of battling mountain blazes. He'd pulled it from storage when the first reports came in, the familiar weight of it reminding him of skills he'd hoped never to use again. The helmet bore burn marks from fires he'd fought as a young man, before he'd met Sarah, before he'd learned that building was more important than fighting. The call came at 4 a.m. from Chief Martinez of the Clearwater Volunteer Fire Department. "Silas, we need every experienced hand we can get. This one's different. It's moving faster than anything we've seen, and it's headed for populated areas." Through the window, Silas could see the orange glow on the southern horizon, closer than it had been when they'd gone to bed. Tucker whined softly, sensing the danger that hung in the smoke-heavy air. "How much time do we have?" Silas asked, already reaching for his boots. "Maybe 6 hours before it reaches the outer evacuation zones. Maybe less if the wind picks up. We're setting up an incident command post at the old logging camp on Route 7. Can you be there by dawn?" Silas looked around the cabin that had become home to 4 people who'd found each other in their brokenness. The irony wasn't lost on him. Fire had destroyed his old life, and now fire threatened to destroy the new one he'd built from those ashes. "I'll be there," he said. The evacuation order came 2 hours later, broadcast over emergency radio channels and delivered by county deputies who drove up the mountain with sirens wailing. All residents within a 10-mile radius of the advancing fire were required to leave immediately. No exceptions, no delays, no negotiations. Anna was the first to reject the order outright. "We're not leaving," she said, standing in the clearing with her guitar case in one hand and her father's tools in the other. "This is our home. We fight for it." Marcus emerged from the workshop carrying a chainsaw and wearing the expression of a man who'd made his decision. "I've seen enough running in my life. I'm staying to help." Dolores appeared on the porch with a thermos of coffee and sandwiches wrapped in wax paper. "Somebody's got to feed the firefighters," she said simply. "Might as well be me." Deputy Sanders, a young man who'd graduated high school with Anna's father, tried to explain the legal requirements and the dangers of defying an evacuation order. But he was facing 4 people who'd already lost everything once and weren't willing to lose it again without a fight. "Sir," he said to Silas, "I understand you want to protect your property, but this fire is unprecedented. The Weather Service is calling it a perfect storm of conditions: drought, wind, temperature, and fuel load. Professional firefighters are getting overwhelmed." Silas adjusted his old helmet, feeling its familiar weight settle into place. "Deputy, I've been fighting fires in these mountains since before you were born. I know what we're up against, and I know what this place means to the people who live here." "We're not running!" The compromise came from Chief Martinez, who arrived just as the standoff was escalating toward confrontation. He surveyed the refuge with the practiced eye of someone who'd spent 30 years calculating risk versus resources. "You've got natural fire breaks here," he observed, noting the creek that ran along the western edge of the property and the cleared areas around the buildings. "And your buildings are newer construction with metal roofs and defensible space. If you're determined to stay, we can make this work as a staging area for the eastern flank operations." What followed was 6 hours of the most intense preparation any of them had ever experienced. Marcus and Anna worked together to clear brush and move combustible materials away from the buildings. Dolores organized supplies and communication equipment, transforming her kitchen into a command center that could feed and coordinate the firefighting. Crews. Silas found himself slipping back into the role he'd played decades earlier, experienced. Crew leader who could read the landscape and anticipate the fire's behavior. But this time, he wasn't just fighting to save anonymous property. He was fighting to preserve the refuge that had become home to people who needed it more than life itself. As the sun reached its peak and the fire crested the ridge that had been their last natural barrier, Silas stood in the clearing with his makeshift family around him, watching the approaching wall of flame and smoke. In his hands, Sarah's planning journal was open to a page where she'd written about the importance of hope in the face of overwhelming odds. Sometimes, her careful handwriting read, "We have to fight for the very thing that's healing us, even when the fight seems impossible. That's when we discover what we're really made of." The battle for their mountain refuge was about to begin. The fire came over the ridge like a living thing, roaring through the crowns of the pines, with a sound that drowned out shouted commands and the rumble of firefighting equipment. Silas stood in the clearing with his radio crackling and his helmet reflecting the orange glow, coordinating the defense of not just their refuge, but 3 other properties that had chosen to make their stand on this section of the mountain. The wind shifted at the worst possible moment, pushing the flames directly toward the cluster of cabins that had become home to their unconventional family. Embers rained down like deadly snow, and the temperature rose until breathing became a conscious effort. Water on the roofs. Silas shouted to Marcus, who was manning the pump they'd set up at the creek. "Anna, keep those hoses moving!" Anna worked with the focused intensity of someone fighting for everything that mattered, dragging heavy hoses across the clearing and setting up sprinkler systems that Marcus had improvised from irrigation equipment. Her young strength and agility made her invaluable in the narrow spaces between buildings, where the larger firefighters couldn't maneuver effectively. Dolores had transformed the main cabin into a field hospital and communication center, treating minor injuries and coordinating with the incident command post miles away. Her kitchen table was covered with maps and radio equipment, and she moved between wounded firefighters and command decisions with the calm efficiency of someone who'd learned to manage crises through decades of raising children and caring for family. The critical moment came when a spot fire ignited in the meadow where Sarah had envisioned expanding the refuge. Fed by dry grass and fanned by erratic winds, it raced toward the propane tanks that supplied fuel for their heating and cooking systems. "If those tanks go, we lose everything," Marcus shouted over the roar of the flames. "The blast will take out the main cabin, and probably the workshop too." Silas looked at the advancing fire, calculating distance and time with the instincts of someone who'd made similar calculations hundreds of times before. But this time, it wasn't just property at stake. It was the home that had healing 4 broken souls and given them purpose beyond their individual pain. "I'm going for the shut-off valves," he said, checking the pressure gauge on his breathing apparatus. "That's suicide," Marcus replied. "You'll never make it through that smoke and heat." But Silas was already moving, Sarah's planning journal tucked inside his jacket next to his heart. He'd carried it through every moment of this crisis, drawing strength from her vision and her faith in what they were building. Together, the run to the propane tanks took him through a gauntlet of falling embers and superheated air that seared his lungs. Despite the breathing equipment, twice he stumbled, blinded by smoke and disoriented by the roar of flames that seemed to come from everywhere at once. He reached the first tank just as the spot fire crowned in the tall grass nearby, sending a wall of flame racing directly toward him. His hands, steady despite the chaos around him, worked the valve mechanisms that would cut off the fuel supply and prevent the catastrophic explosion that would destroy everything they'd built. The second valve was harder to reach, partially blocked by debris and positioned where the heat was most intense. Silas felt his gear beginning to fail, felt the familiar burn of smoke inhalation that brought back memories of other fires, of the desperate moments when survival came down to training and determination. As he worked the final valve, he heard Anna's voice cutting through the roar of the flames. She was singing, not shouting instructions or calling for help, but singing the song she'd written about finding home in the mountains. Her clear, strong voice carried across the clearing, giving every firefighter something to focus on besides the chaos and destruction surrounding them. The valve finally turned, and Silas felt the pressure drop that meant the propane supply was secured. But the spot fire was still advancing, and he was trapped between 2 walls of flame with his breathing apparatus running low and his strength beginning to fail. That's when he saw them. Marcus running toward him with a fresh oxygen tank, Anna dragging a hose line that could provide cover for his retreat, and Dolores coordinating the water drops from the helicopters that had finally arrived to provide aerial support. His family had come for him, just as he'd come for them when they'd needed rescue from their own kinds of fires. The retreat to safety was a controlled chaos of water and smoke and desperate teamwork. Marcus reached him first, replacing his failing breathing apparatus and providing cover, while Anna's hose line created a corridor of relative safety through the flames. By the time they reached the clearing, the wind had shifted again, pushing the main fire away from their buildings and toward the natural fire breaks that would slow its advance. The spot fires were contained, the propane tanks were secure, and their refuge stood intact amid the blackened landscape. As the immediate crisis passed and the exhausted firefighters began assessing damage and planning the next phase of operations, Silas pulled Sarah's journal from his jacket and opened it to the page he'd been thinking about during his desperate run to the propane tanks. Her words, written years before any of them had found their way to this mountain, seemed prophetic in the aftermath of their shared triumph. Sometimes the things we build with love are strong enough to survive the very forces that brought us together. That's when we know we've created something worth fighting for. 3 months after the fire, Silas stood in the same clearing where he'd first discovered the abandoned Henderson cabin, but the view had changed in ways that would have seemed impossible a year earlier. The blackened hillsides were already showing the first green shoots of new growth, and the expanded refuge bustled with the quiet activity of a community that had found its purpose. The artifact that best represented their transformation sat on the mantel of the new common building, a wooden plaque carved by Marcus from a pine tree that had survived the fire. It bore a simple inscription: Mountain Heart's Refuge, where broken souls become whole families. Below the words was a date, the anniversary of the fire that had brought Silas to the mountain. And below that, another date, the day they'd successfully defended their home from the flames. Anna emerged from the workshop, where she'd been teaching guitar to 3 new residents who'd arrived over the summer. At 17 now, she carried herself with the confidence of someone who'd found her place in the world and was helping others find theirs. Her father's guitar had been joined by 2 others, creating a small music program that Dr. Vasquez documented as remarkably effective in helping traumatized individuals process their experiences. "Silas," Anna called out, jogging across the clearing with Tucker at her heels. The dog had become the unofficial greeter for new residents, somehow able to sense who needed gentle encouragement and who needed space to adjust. "Dr. Vasquez is here for her evaluation, and she brought someone with her." The someone turned out to be Dr. James Harrison, a researcher from the University of Montana who was studying innovative approaches to trauma treatment and community healing. He'd heard about Mountain Heart's Refuge from Dr. Vasquez and had requested permission to document their methods for potential replication in other communities. "Mr. Boone," Dr. Harrison said, shaking Silas's weathered hand, "I've been following your progress through Dr. Vasquez's reports. What you've accomplished here challenges some fundamental assumptions about how healing happens." Silas led the 2 doctors on a tour of the expanded refuge, now home to 12 residents ranging in age from Anna to Dolores, who at 74 had become the unofficial grandmother to everyone who found their way to the mountain. Her blue recipe box sat in the common kitchen, its contents copied and shared so that cooking had become a form of therapy and a way of preserving family traditions that might otherwise be lost. Marcus had completed his transformation from broken veteran to master craftsman and unofficial construction manager. His grandfather's toolbox sat in the workshop he'd built, but it was now accompanied by tools belonging to other residents who'd discovered that working with their hands was a powerful form of healing. The furniture they created was sold in galleries in Billings and Missoula, providing income that helped support the refugees' operations. The key insight: Dr. Vasquez explained to her colleague as they watched Marcus teach woodworking techniques to a recently arrived veteran struggling with severe depression, is that healing happens through purpose, not just through processing trauma. These people aren't just getting therapy, they're building something meaningful together. The refuge now operated as a licensed non-profit organization, thanks to Sarah's careful planning and the legal framework she'd established in her trust documents. They had formal partnerships with the VA hospital, the County Social Services Department, and 3 universities that were studying their community-based approach to healing. But the real measure of their success wasn't in the academic papers or the official recognition. It was in the stories of transformation that played out daily in the clearing among the pines. There was Margaret, the 68-year-old widow who'd arrived suicidal and isolated, but had found new purpose teaching children from the valley how to garden using techniques she'd learned from her immigrant grandmother. There was David, the young veteran whose traumatic brain injury had left him struggling with memory and coordination until he discovered an aptitude for the precise, meditative work of furniture making. There was Elena, the teenage mother who'd been aging out of foster care until she found a supportive family structure that allowed her to finish high school while learning practical skills for supporting herself and her baby. Each new resident brought their own artifact of loss, a wedding ring from a dissolved marriage, a diploma from a career ended by injury, a photograph of family members lost to addiction or violence. But over time, these artifacts of pain were joined by new objects that represented hope and healing, tools they'd mastered, crafts they'd created, letters from family members with whom they'd reconciled. As the sun set behind the mountains that evening, the entire community gathered in the common building for their weekly sharing circle. It was a tradition that had evolved naturally, a time when anyone could speak about their struggles, their progress, or their gratitude for the second chance they'd found on the mountain. Anna spoke last, as she often did, her guitar across her lap and her green eyes reflecting the firelight. A year ago, I thought my story was over. I thought the best parts of my life had died with my parents, and all I had left was trying to survive until I was old enough to be on my own. She strummed a gentle chord progression, the same melody she'd been working on since her first week at the refuge. But I learned something up here that nobody ever taught me before. Family isn't just about who you're born to. It's about who chooses to love you when you can't love yourself, who believes in your future when you can't see past your pain, who fights beside you when everything you care about is threatened. Her voice grew stronger as she continued. We're all broken people who found each other in a broken place and discovered that broken things can be made beautiful when they're put together with love and patience and honest work. Outside, the wind moved through the pines with the sound of whispered promises, and somewhere in that gentle music, Silas could almost hear Sarah's voice telling him that he'd built something that would have made her proud. The mountain refuge had become exactly what she'd envisioned, not just a place of healing, but a testament to the truth that love doesn't end with death. It just finds new ways to work in the world. As the sharing circle ended and the residents made their way to their cabins, Silas remained by the fire with Tucker at his feet and Sarah's planning journal open in his lap. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities to extend healing to broken souls who needed what they'd built here. But tonight, surrounded by the family he'd never expected to find, Silas Boone was simply grateful for the strange and wonderful path that had led him from the ashes of his old life to the living beauty of this new one.